Hello, it's Seiji, and today I'm going to be talking about a couple of books that I recently said. Now, my notes say I have 14 books that I would like to talk about, but I don't know if we're going to get through all of them in a timely fashion. But yeah, let's start with the first one, which is The Life of a Stupid Man by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. This black little classic, and it contains 3 short works of Akutagawa. You might know him because his name is actually attached to one of the most prestigious Japanese literary awards, and so many of the Japanese authors who eventually have their work translated into English, you'll see that they, amongst others, have won this prize. For instance, Sayaka Murata is a great example of that. But yes, 3 short pieces of literature, the first one being fiction and the last 2 non-fiction. I was thoroughly amused by the first one, which is actually also my favorite, and it's called In a Bamboo Grove. It basically consists of different accounts of people surrounding a murder. A man is found dead in a bamboo grove with a hole in his chest, and so several people get questioned as to what really happened. And the interesting thing about this is that all the accounts together are contradicting, so you actually don't know what happened at the end. And I don't know, it was just so captivating to read. I really loved the structure of the short story. The other 2 pieces, which were Death Register and The Life of a Stupid Man, the titular one, were pretty good as well, but I think these would have been more interesting for me if I had known more about Akutagawa's life and work. If I remember correctly, Death Register is about his fears of having the same illness as his mother had, which was schizophrenia. The last one is The Life of a Stupid Man, which is basically an autobiography that consists of 51 small passages, in which he mainly talks about the darker parts of his life. And like I said previously, before picking up this book, I didn't really know that much about Akutagawa, and so that made the 2 last parts a bit harder to read. So would I call this a great introduction to Akutagawa's work? Not particularly. I think the first story was excellent for that, but the other 2 not so much. So if you're interested in reading his work, I would actually recommend trying out Rashoumon and 17 Other Stories. And if you're still interested in trying out this one, I would still recommend Rashoumon because it also collects these 3 stories. But yeah, like the titular story, Rashoumon was really good as well. I haven't finished this collection, but I'm very much looking forward to the other stories. So that was it for this book. You'll see this one back in another video, I presume. Moving on, we have Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and this was actually the first book that I read together with my Diverse Classics book club over on Patreon, and yeah, it was great. It was so good. It's a really short story. Basically, it's about this man named Santiago Nazar, and he gets killed, absolutely gruesomely murdered by a pair of twins. And the story isn't necessarily about Santiago's death or who killed them, because that is all known from the start. What's interesting is the entire town actually knew that this murder was going to take place, and yet still nobody was able to save him. And the story basically answers the question of how could this have happened. And you know, you have to have a certain amount of skill to write a story in which the end is already known and it to still be an amazing and thrilling story. Because whoa, I was blown away. Admittedly, at the start it was a bit hard to follow because you get introduced to a lot of characters, and I actually sort of stopped at page 15 and then went back to read everything again. But yeah, it was really good and so well structured. I was so impressed by this novella. There have rarely been stories where my brain couldn't compute what was happening. It was so weird because little by little the tension keeps getting higher and higher leading up to Santiago's death, and at some point my mind was like, no, they're going to save him. Yeah, he'll be fine. He can't die. No, Santiago's going to be fine. And of course he wasn't. He died. And still I was shocked. That's how good this story was. Yeah, it was great. Moving on to the third book, which is Ormeshadow by Rashoumon, and I actually feel like this is a hidden gem of Tor.com. It came out back in October, and I was just very captivated by the book cover, and then after reading the synopsis I knew that this was a story that I would like to try out. So to give you a short summary, this book is a coming of age story about a boy named Gideon Bellman. Now Gideon's father had a good position in Bath, I believe as a scholar or a professor, but anyway something happens and that basically leaves them no other choice but to leave Bath and go to the Ormesleep farm where his father grew up. And so there they live together with Gideon's uncle's family. Now the interesting thing about this land is that it has a legend. Apparently under the land there sleeps an Orm, or a dragon, and the history of that dragon is tied to the Bellman's history. And like I said, this is a coming of age story, so we follow Gideon as he grows older and starts to realize what is happening around him, mainly within his family and extended family. And yeah, I thought this was a really interesting story. I did, however, expect it to have a lot of dragons and just lots of fantasy, but it's far more subtle than that, which isn't a bad thing, or at least I didn't think it was a bad thing. But yeah, knowing this up front definitely is helpful with, I guess, managing your expectations if you're planning on giving this one a go, which I would definitely recommend. The next one I read is Fleabag by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and I actually met her when I was in London, and she signed my copy, which was really cool. So I actually haven't seen the TV series. I only read this play and I thought it was really interesting. So for those who don't know what Fleabag is, it's basically the story of this lady who just talks about like her experiences, such as owning a hamster-themed cafe, her boyfriend who has left her for the gazillionth time, her relationship with her sister, her father, and much more. It kind of feels like a stream of consciousness, like basically thinking out loud. And yeah, I just thought it was very interesting and entertaining. So yeah, that's what I have to say with regards to Fleabag. Then Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. So I read this for a part and also listened to the audio book, and I thought it was quite alright. It's a short story collection that has like a sort of scary, macabre feel to it. Enriquez managed to combine horror with societal issues, which I thought was very interesting. But like I said previously, the majority of this book I listened to as an audiobook, and usually I'm not as engaged with a story when I'm listening to it. I'm not really examining it as critically as when I am actually reading a physical copy. So I don't really have too many points that I would like to discuss, but I do think that I'll come back to this book eventually sometime this year to take a better look at it. But nevertheless, the stories were quite good and I enjoyed them. Now let's just quickly talk about The Last Children of Tokyo by Yoko Tawada, because I actually DNF'd this book. So this book, as the title suggests, is set in Tokyo, and you follow this man who is over 100 years old. And the thing is that now all of the older people have become, I guess, like sort of immortal almost. They have an incredibly long lifespan, and so people are considered young old people and actual old people. So like for instance, if you're like, I don't know, 80 or so, you're considered a young old person. Now the the thing is that the children that have been recently born are incredibly fragile and weak, and so the roles are kind of turned around. So now you have the old people who are supporting the younger people. Another thing that I should mention is that Japan has completely closed its borders and has been slowly sort of like phasing out all foreign things, including loanwords. And there also seems to have been this, I don't know, like toxic waste event that triggered Japan's closure. But anyway, that's as far as I got with this novel. I think I read about 60 pages and it has altogether 138. Anyway, the reason why I DNF'd this book was that it was so boring to me. It was very slow paced and a lot of time was just spent talking about the changes in Japan, like the different words that had changed, the things that had disappeared, or where you could get different fruits, and what, I don't know, Tokyo wanted to try and grow in the ground, and etc. etc. And that wasn't interesting for me, and reading about that for more than 50 pages just wore me out. So after that I just had to quit. Now I was actually considering giving away this book, but I think I'll just hold on to it for a while and try and see, maybe in a couple of months or maybe next year I'll try it again, because I do feel that the end might be promising, but I'm just not willing to read more at this point. Then I also read GEEK, a head-to-toe memoir, and this was a graphic novel. The writer Ariella was also the artist, and in the book she kind of like recounts her journey of accepting and celebrating her body. And unfortunately I didn't like it. It just didn't really speak to me, and I think I'll just leave it at that. I also read The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, and I would like to thank Pantheon for gifting me this book. So basically this story follows a writer who lives on an unknown island, and the peculiar thing about this island is that things frequently disappear. So take for instance, I don't know, pencils. People wake up in the morning and they feel like there's something rough in the air, and slowly they start to realize that pencils have disappeared. So what happens is that they all collect their pencils and they'll just burn all of them. And then the memory police comes in, like actual people, and they make sure that all the pencils on the island are gone. And so as this is happening, people lose the meaning of pencils and the memories that they have attached to pencils. There are, however, people on the island who that doesn't happen to, so they keep remembering all of these things. And the memory police doesn't like them, so they try and round them up, lock them away, which also happens to the main character's mother. Now eventually the writer's editor turns out to be also such a person who still can remember, and as the memory police becomes stricter and stricter and starts rounding people up more frequently, he eventually ends up hiding in this writer's home. And that is basically the premise of this story. I thought it was very interesting. It made me think a lot about memories and the importance of them and the meaning of them, like what exactly is a memory and what happens once you lose memories. And the scary thing is that this is actually a reality for people, for instance those who have Alzheimer's. In this case though, it feels more enforced because of the memory police, and that kind of reminded me of the Second World War. But yeah, I felt this book gave me a lot of food for thought, and I thought it was quite interesting. Though a week after finishing this book, I actually listened to another piece of Ogawa's work called Revenge, and I actually liked that one far more. The Memory Police was more literary fiction compared to Revenge, which was really on the side of like horror and thriller. It was this collection of 11 short stories which were all set in the same place, which had reoccurring characters, and like you had all these evil and weird things happening, and it was just really interesting. So I would definitely recommend that, and I'll talk about that one more in another video because I am definitely planning on giving that a full single review. Yeah, then moving on to another which I am planning on actually hopefully reviewing next week, which is The Whale That Fell in Love with a Submarine. And this is actually a children's book. This was written by the Japanese author Akiyuki Nosaka, and it's basically a short story collection about mainly children and animals during the Second World War. And it's focused around the 5th of August 1945, which was the day that Japan actually surrendered. It's a very interesting but incredibly gloomy and sad piece of literature. Nosaka himself actually experienced the Second World War as a child in Japan and lost most of his family, including his 2 sisters, during that time, and so a lot of his work was heavily inspired by that. And yeah, thinking about children experiencing war on whatever side they're on is just heartbreaking. Having to deal with some of the worst atrocities in the world at such a young age, you really wish for no one to go through that. And I think these stories really serve as a reminder to what it's like being a child during war times. Moving on, I finally know what happened in the last Hunger Games book. So I actually didn't read it. I've had this copy for more than 8 years now, but for some reason I always ended up DNFing it after a couple of pages, and now I'm actually quite glad that I did so, because I think that if I'd finished reading this book like 8 years ago, I think it would have spoiled the series for me, because this one really was a bummer in my opinion. I remember reading book 1 and 2 and being so immersed in the story and really feeling empathy for all of these characters. And last year I listened to book 1 and 2 again, and I had those same feelings. It was so easy to have empathy for these characters and really root for them. But in this one, wow, Man, I really didn't care what would happen to most of these people. I didn't remember Katniss being this annoying and self-centered, in my opinion. I could not understand the appeal that she had, because she just came across as this really mean girl. But then you had Peter and Gil so desperate to have her. I just didn't really like or even understand the chemistry in this love triangle anymore. And the end felt so abrupt and weird. I didn't understand why no one just asked like, okay Katniss, why did you kill Coin? It was just like, okay, let's have this trial without her, and then we'll send her back to 12, and that's the end of that. Literally, the new president of America got assassinated, and everyone is just like, oh well, we can have that other woman from, I don't know, District 8 take her place. That's fine. We'll send Katniss away. I was so confused. And then Katniss had kids, which she didn't want, but apparently Peter really wanted it, so she was like, okay, I'll have the kids, and that's the end of the story. It felt like these characters in the last book made such an unnatural progression. I didn't really buy it, so I don't know, I felt disappointed. Anyway, I think we made it through a good 9 or 10 books, so I'll talk about the others in a future video. Yes, so thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in another video.